Good evening, everyone. I'm Luis Herrera. I'm the city librarian, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's 16th annual Effie Lee Morris Lecture. Can you believe it's been 16 years of this wonderful, wonderful legacy and celebration of children's literature? Yeah, how about a round of applause? I always remark that this is one of my favorite events for various reasons, but first and foremost because I am a big fan of Effie Lee Morris. We go back quite a while, and yeah, absolutely, it's almost like you can feel her essence in this room. And I have to tell you, on a personal note, she was indeed a trailblazer in so many ways. What I share in common with her that I'm very proud of is that she was president of the Public Library Association when she was a trailblazer. She was the first African American to serve in that capacity, which is pretty remarkable. And I had the honor of serving as PLA president years later, but I always would call on her and ask for advice. And then, lo and behold, I ended up as city librarian. So she would make sure that I would not forget her true passion, which is all about children's literature and children's services. All of you know by now that she was the first coordinator of children's services here in San Francisco. And we're so proud of that because we continue to honor her by doing the best we can to elevate that service level in everything we do. Not only in promoting the love of books and literature, but being out in the community. And I thought it was so appropriate, Jerry, that the theme was all about a sense of place, real or imagined, because when you think of our libraries, what better place than our neighborhood libraries and here, this beautiful building that truly celebrate that engagement in our neighborhood and seeing our youth develop and be productive in everything they do. So it's indeed a pleasure to welcome you all tonight. I am also very proud of the remarkable work that our children's librarians do. They absolutely do a fantastic job. From our head of Children and Youth Services, Toni Bernardi, to Loretta Dowell, that does a wonderful job in arranging and orchestrating this wonderful event, to all the core of children's librarians that are out there doing great work. I see them all out there with the wonderful, wonderful smiles. But the other side of our partnership, I also feel the presence here of so many school librarians and media librarians. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how many of you know this, but I was one of you. My first job was as a school librarian, a middle school librarian in my old middle school. So I just absolutely always talk about how that was one of my favorite all-time jobs. But anyway, I digress because I certainly have a passion for that connection and how important it is to have the partnership with the public library. And I think here in San Francisco, we're setting the bar very high in terms of that collaboration. So I appreciate the fact that we have so many class visits, that our librarians are embedded in your schools and in your communities to do the great job of promoting literacy and learning, which in fact happens to be one of our key priorities. So with that, Jerry, we are thrilled that you are here today. We are honored to have you in San Francisco and looking forward to a wonderful event this evening. And with that, I pass the program over to Toni Bernardi. Toni.
Good evening, everyone. I add my welcome to our city librarians and you school librarians out there. Forget it. You're not getting him back. He belongs to us now. Our city librarian noted this lecture is named in honor of Miss Effie Lee Morris, and she was the first children's coordinator here. She was coordinator from 1963 to 1977, and she was one of the pioneer children's services librarians in the nation, and an incredible woman. I always kept saying I always wanted to be Miss Morris when I grew up, whenever I talked with her, and she was such a delight and had such a sense of humor. It was very dry, and she knew every bit of scandal about every librarian in the United States, let me tell you. She was fun to listen to. She really helped develop the broad range and programs that we have today for children in San Francisco, and we continue to honor that tradition as well as instituting new ones. Prior to her retirement, Ms. Morris established the Effie Lee Morris Historical Literature and Research Collection for Children's Literature, And basically that collection emphasizes award-winning books, books that deal with ethnic change, the views and how we look at ethnicity within children's literature, and books set in the Bay Area, specifically San Francisco, or written by authors in the Bay Area. So that collection inspired the Women's National Book Association to come to us one day and say that they were interested in doing something to honor Miss Morris in addition. And so we had our first little event several years ago, 16 now, where we got together and we sort of showed them some of the highlights of the collection. And discussions continued, and they decided that they would like to help us institute a lecture in honor of Miss Morris, who was also one of the pioneer founders of the San Francisco chapter of the Women's National Book Association. So we did discuss that, and we decided to institute that lecture, and we have been very blessed and very privileged to have an incredible array of authors and illustrators come and speak with us about their work. The lecture is a companion piece to the collection. Basically, the collection looks back. It looks back at what people wrote about children and for children and how we viewed children in those times. But the lecture gives us the opportunity to hear from those really talented and wonderful people who are carrying on that tradition and writing for children today, and to have them share their expertise and their enthusiasm and the thoughts behind their work. And so it kind of brings that collection alive in a very different manner. And we are very happy to have had the opportunity for the past 15 years to experience the wonderful people who have come here. And we're going to continue with tonight with a very, very exciting speaker. And I fought Loretta for the privilege, and she won. She gets to introduce him. Now, this is not a happy thing for me because I have this huge crush on Jerry Pinkney. On his work and himself as a person, he is a wonderful, delightful person. Unfortunately, he has an equally wonderful, delightful, and beautiful wife, so there you go. What are you going to do? So to get us started, I'm going to introduce Loretta Dowell. She's the manager of the Main Library Children's Center, and she is responsible for all the details of putting this lecture together every year, including the receptions and the food that come right beforehand. So, Loretta, you won the fight, so here you are.
Good evening and welcome to the 16th Annual Effie Lee Morris Lecture. My name is Loretta Dowell, and I'm the manager of the Fisher Children's Center here at the Main Library. I would like to thank everyone who participated in making this program possible this evening. Darren Brown in the Custodial Department, Dave Schwabe and Media Services, Rain Free and Red Door Catering, Barbara McMahon and Norm Carlotta in the Graphics Department, all the members of the Effie Lee Morris Lecture Committee, Lynn Davison, Rochelle Resnick, Catherine O'Farrell, Rosie Maryland, Stuart Shaw, Michelle Jeffers, Barbara McMahon, Toni Bernardi, Christy Estrovitz, and a special thank you to Ann Carroll in exhibits and programming, and many thanks to my supervisor, Toni Bernardi, for her support, and to my favorite city librarian, Luis Herrera. And a special thank you to the Children's Center staff, Victoria Stapleton of Little Brown Publishing, to our sponsors, the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library, and again to Stuart Shaw of the African American Center here at the Main Library, to the SF chapter of Women's National Book Association, and a very special thank you to Mr. Jerry Pinkney for accepting the invitation to be our guest lecturer this evening. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a fellow Philadelphian. Jerry Pinkney was born on December 22, 1939 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is the middle son of 6 children born to James H. and Willie Mae Pinkney. He grew up on Earlham Street in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood and was influenced by his older brothers, Edward and Billy, who would draw from comic books and photo magazines. He graduated from Dobbins Vocational High School in 1957, where he studied commercial art, and it was there that he met and later married Gloria Maltsby in 1960. They are the parents of Troy Bernadette, Jerry Bryan, Scott Cannon, and Miles Carter. Mr. Pinkney attended the Philadelphia College of Art on a full scholarship. His first job as a designer illustrator was with the Russ Craft Greeting Card Company in Dedham, Massachusetts, and later with Barker Black Studio in Boston, Massachusetts. While at Barker Black Studio in 1964, he illustrated his first book, The Adventures of Spider, West African Folktales Retold by Joyce Cooper Ackhurst. He was a co-founder of Kaleidoscope Studio along with two other illustrators, Joe Vino and Rob Howard. In 1970, he made a career move to relocate to New York, which led to the creation of the Jerry Pinkney Studio. His goal was to freelance and become an established book illustrator, and New York presented that opportunity. He served as an associate professor of illustration and art and a visiting artist at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, University of Delaware, and the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. Mr. Pinkney's work speaks to the issue of being African American and the influence of African American contributions to society. He was a designer of the Black Heritage series of commemorative stamps for the United States Postal Service, and also served on the Stamp Advisory Committee from 1982 to 1992. His work has been exhibited in museums throughout the world and the United States. Mr. Pinkney is a member of the Society of Illustrators and was just recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mr. Pinkney's current exhibit is touring the United States. The exhibit is called Witness, The Art of Jerry Pinkney, organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It is an overview of 50 years of Jerry Pinkney's career as a designer and an illustrator. The next stop for the exhibit is the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan, then on to Yonkers, New York, Dallas, Texas, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the last stop will be the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Georgia. Please come upstairs if you get a chance today to view his exhibit called From Sketch to Book, and it will be on view until May 31st. Mr. Pinkney has won many awards and honors. His first was the New Jersey Technology Award for Babushka and the Pig in 1969. He is the recipient of 4 Coretta Scott King Honor Awards for illustration, and the first honor award he received was in 1981 for Count on Your Fingers, African Style by Claudia Zalaski. His first of 5 Coretta Scott King Illustrator Awards was received in 1986 for the Patchwork Quilt by Valerie Flournoy, and that was in 1986. He has been the recipient of 5 Randolph Caldecott Honor Awards, beginning in 1989, for Marindy and Brother Wynn by Patricia McKissick, which also received the Coretta Scott King Illustrator Award that same year. He received the Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts from the Art Institute of Boston at Lesley University in Cambridge in 1984, and many other citations and medals. He will receive an Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters from the Bank Street Graduate School of Education in New York on May 24th this year. Mr. Pinkney is the first individual African-American artist to be awarded the Randolph Caldecott Medal for The Lion and the Mouse in 2010. Children's literature has been graced with the genius of Jerry Pinkney's outstanding art and illustrations for over 4 decades. We are very fortunate that he has shared his eminent gift of art with the world. We thank you, Mr. Pinkney, for allowing our eyes to witness your awesome work. I present to you Coretta Scott King Illustrator Award and Randolph Caldecott Medal recipient, Mr. Jerry Pinkney.
Well, good evening. Boy, that was great, huh? Well, thank you. I knew Effie Lee Morris. Interesting enough, it's been exciting to hear and see the kind of respect paid for her. And I must admit, when I saw her pictures on the screen there, I couldn't help but go back with a smile. And I think in so many ways, I always felt that she was taking care of me. and as well as she took care of other artists and authors. There was just so much spirit, so it was good to see this, in a way, a celebration of her memory and certainly her work. Thank you, Loretta. That was great, and I think it ties in directly with my presentation this evening, because Loretta mentioned the exhibition Witness that is traveling now. And it was interesting enough, it gave me time to pause a little bit to think about how did this all come about. 50 years, and it was 50 years of really getting up in the morning and going to work. And I loved the work. So this attention being paid didn't necessarily catch me by surprise, but it did certainly give me an opportunity to think about those really building blocks. In the past, I have always talked about the relationship, my true muse, which was my mother, Willie Mae, who was my champion from the very beginning. But I began to start thinking about my environment, Earlham Street, and my father, who was a very kind of a difficult person, began to sort of unpeel our relationship and how he has influenced my work. So I'm going to talk about environment, I'm going to talk about tools, and I'm going to share with you things, new images that really go back to the early 1960s, which is really where it all began. My work is text-based, excuse me. Let me do this. All right, good. Now I'm all set. I grew up in a dead-end street in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it was a neighborhood or a block of African American. Everyone had mainly migrated, neighbors had migrated from the South. And so the whole block really had a sense of a Southern culture. I mean, I think the food we ate, there was this sense of style. There was also the powerful sense of storytelling. And I think it was really there where I began to understand that kind of power. And what I remembered was that it was not only adults, parents reading stories to children, but adults were telling other adults stories. And my bedroom, I shared my bedroom with two older brothers, was on the second landing of our small house. And when the weather was warm, you could actually hear the conversations and this swapping of stories that adults would partake in. My mother was interesting enough. She loved reading, but what I remember more than anything was the animated storytelling. And I think oftentimes when I talk about my work, the intent is to bring about that same kind of energy and animation that I remembered as a kid growing up. Now, the stories that I most remember didn't happen sitting on someone's lap. It happened in the barbershop or in the backyard. And it was always thrilling. And in a sense, I always say that in many ways, those characters are really speaking about the kind of thrill and the excitement of just storytelling. Now, my mother loved. This is interesting because my mother loved Emerson. She read Emerson and the Bible. She also loved the classics. The Hans Christian Andersen. You're going to see through this presentation how the thread runs from those very, very early days till now. I was born in 1939. Of course, I was 5 or 6 years old, of course, with World War II, and you'll see also how that kind of influences. I remembered very clearly when my parents used to get Life magazine. And there was a large formatted photojournalistic magazines. But during the World War II, that time period when we were actually at the understanding and getting fed those images from liberated concentration camps, my parents didn't want us to know about that period, and they would hide them away. And remember, there was a wardrobe on a second-floor landing. And I would remember they would go oftentimes, and I would be left in the house alone, and I could remember sitting cross-legged on that second-floor landing, looking at these images and being terribly moved by them. You're going to see that in my work as well. But let me start with, I started with the fact that my work is literature-based. It's text-based. Stories that I grew up with was the Tales of Uncle Remus, it's Aesop's Fables, and so important to an African-American young boy, the story of John Henry. You probably never heard of John Henry, or maybe you heard about him, but you don't know the ins and outs of his comings and goings. Well, that's why I'm going to tell you about him. When John Henry was born, birds came from everywhere to see him. The bears and the panthers and the moose and the deer and the rabbits and squirrels, and even a unicorn came out of the woods to see him. And instead of the sun tending to his business and going to bed, it was peeping out from behind the moon's skirts, trying to get a glimpse of the new baby. Before long, the mama and papa come out on the porch to show off their brand new baby. The birds oohed, and the animals awed at how handsome that baby was. Somewhere in the middle of one of those oohs, or maybe it was the backside of one of those ahs, that baby jumped out of his mama's arms and started growing. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until his head and shoulders busted through the roof, which was over the porch. John Henry thought that was the funniest thing in the world. He laughed so loud, the sun got scared. It scurried from behind the moon's skirts and went to bed, which is where it should have been all the while. The next morning, John Henry was up at sunrise. Sun wasn't. He was tired and decided to sleep in. John Henry wasn't going to have none of that. He hollered up into the sky, "Get up from there. I got things to do and I need light to do them by." Sun yawned, washed his face, flossed and brushed his teeth, and hurried up over the horizon. That day, John Henry helped his papa rebuild the porch he had busted through, added a wing onto the house with an indoor swimming pool and one of those jacuzzis. After lunch, he chopped down an acre of trees and split them into fireplace logs and still had time for a nap before supper. Julius Lester was the author, and it's an amazing read aloud. I think a lot of your librarians and teachers, you'll enjoy that aspect of it. I said that was important to me. Growing up as an African American with very few books that mirrored or echoed people of color, to know this powerful story of the legend of John Henry, you can see how it moved me. And it's interesting enough, this is the first book that I initiated. And up until that point, what would happen is that a publisher would acquire a story, then I would be asked to illustrate it. Well, I was sitting in my agent's office one day, and we were talking about the possibility of future projects. And he asked me if there was a project that you really felt you had to do, what would that be? I don't think there was a heartbeat or a blink of the eye, and I said John Henry. And it was my first attempt to adapt the story, but I found that I was well over my head. And I had worked with Julius Lester on the Tales of Uncle Remus, so it was natural for me to suggest Julius to write the story. As I talked a little bit about that period of all the kind of excitement and energy and around World War II, and it did affect me, and I think later on you see how I've been moved through the images I've created, especially dealing with slavery. But the house was also filled not only with storytelling but with music. And it really truly was about this wonderful sense of style. My parents, of course, especially my mother, listened to gospel. My sister Joan loved jazz, and there was constantly always music going. So that you see through my projects that, in a sense, a lot of them deal with music, with the subject of music, and but I also love poetry. Now, something that's very important. I'll get this a little later. I want to stay with just this one moment. I had an opportunity to work with Marilyn Nelson, the poet, on a project. And it was really, the project was sort of created with my editor suggesting, how would you like to work with Marilyn? And I said I had known her work, and we had often talked, and like so many of us when we get together, authors and illustrators, we say, one day let's do a project together. And of course, most oftentimes that doesn't happen, but it did with Marilyn and I. Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was an all-girl swing band coming out of Piney Woods, Mississippi. It's a powerful musicians, but I think one of the things that makes it so important to us in terms of American history, not only were they great female musicians, but they were one of the few bands to integrate. They came out of Piney Woods, Mississippi, and as an all-female band of color. At some point, they went national. They were, during the after the Civil War, there was a lot of private schools that were created to actually educate people of color. In most cases, they were basically learning life skills, and oftentimes to keep the doors open, they would form a chorus or a band, and those bands would actually travel, most often locally, to raise money. The Sweethearts proved to be a powerful force in music, and went national, and during that period integrated the band. First with a white musician, then a Native American, and a Hawaiian, and an Asian American. The white musicians, when they played on stages in the South, actually had to powder their faces dark in order to be able to play. But this is one of the poems that speaks out to me. It's called Black and Tan Fantasy. It was solace then that swing music gave those crowds. You and your sweethearts were really soldiers of music, living like tumbleweed, baffless and underpaid, to uplift the nation's fallen morale with acoustics. Were you generating resilience as you played that bouncy rhythm defined by its thrill-filled time? Was an antidote found in jitterbug like mad? To the middle of the century defined by progress and crime, was it democratic music, making every toe tap and every heart lift towards courage again over fear? Was it music more transcendent than of escape? Each tune a tiny little victory over war. I see so every swing band, without speaking its name, sort of thumbed America's nose at the threat of fascism. Swing music wasn't half as valid as it seemed. You were bringing the madman down just by swinging the rhythm. Tools. My father was a jack of all trades. He was a plumber. He was an electrician. He was a carpenter. He was a house painter. You name it, my father could fix it or paint it. His workshop, where he kept his tools, were in the basement of our tiny house. By the way, there was 8 of us. It was 5 rooms, 1 bath without a sink. How we negotiated that, I have no idea. But my father's workshop, again, was in the basement. And what I remembered was when he would go off to work, and I would go down in the basement. I would hold the tools that my father used. And if we, for those of you who can think back that far, the quality of tools, the beauty of a hammer or a saw, and when in the summers when I was 12, 13, my father, I would tag along with my father to help him out during the day, and he would teach me how to saw. He would teach me how to drill or to plane wood, and he loved refinishing furniture. And he would teach me how to do that. And in so many ways, the respect for materials and tools really came from my father. And the tools that I work with today, many of them I've had 25, 30, 40 years. It's just this sort of reverence for tools. So you'll in the process of making my pictures, the joy of it oftentimes is it's the making of, it's the holding the brush in the hand, or it's the paper the feel of the paper that I use, and that really came directly from my father. There were no artists in my family. There were no artists in the neighborhood. Therefore, of course, no role models. I loved drawing, and as far back as I can remember, and if some of you have read things I've written about those early years and the respect I have for the pencil, it was interesting just recently I discovered, we've always talked about the fact that you would find me with a sketch pad or a pencil in hand. My father, when he would come back from wallpaper, he would bring back the swatches of patterned wallpaper, and I'd flip it over and draw on the plain side. And it was always the pencil. I just recently found out my grandfather worked in a pencil factory. So that's where the tools came from. I met my first professional artist at the age of 12. And I took a job selling newspapers at a very busy intersection in the Germantown section. In between selling newspapers, I would always take a drawing pad and pencil with me. And in between selling newspapers, I would draw people waiting for the bus or the trolley. And it turns out that one of my customers who bought a newspaper from me was a cartoonist. And he took note of me drawing one day and invited me up to his studio. His name was John Liney. The comic strip was Henry. So I can remember that day so clearly, visiting Mr. Liney in his studio and going into that huge space with sketches tacked on the wall. And in the center of that space, he had his drawing table and his tabouret. And remember, I said I had a drawing pad and some pencils. Well, Mr. Liney had drawing pads, different sizes, different shapes. And he had pencils, of course, and brushes, and he worked in watercolor and inks. So he had a full array of materials, which was actually, you can imagine how I felt as a young boy entering into that space. Now, the experience was wonderful. But I think out of that, which was most important, was that had to be that experience, that visit with Mr. Liney was when the seed of possibility was planted for me. And it was then that I thought about that something that you love doing could actually be a vocation. It could be how you provide for a family. And that's where you see me here today. Anyway, let's go move on and let's start looking at some images. I'm going to go back. Lights and slides, please. I got some water. All right, that's my grandfather, Charles. He was the one who worked in the pencil factory. And as I said, we lived on a dead-end street, and my grandfather and grandmother had the last house. You know, that was a stone wall, which marked a dead-end street. I have to tell you, I look at this slide and look how proud. But I often wonder now, was my grandfather holding the little red hen? That's my mom and my dad, and I'm still trying to dress like my dad. And that's the street. It was a small street of row houses. And that Ford Woody was the car we would all pile in. And when my relatives did well, of course, they moved out of the city, and they built homes in the suburbs and then in the country. I loved visiting my folks, my relatives in the country, which was New Jersey. But at those days, New Jersey was in fact country, and as kids we grew up. And I think if you think about my reverence for nature, it really came from a city kid having the opportunity to experience nature in the way that I did. That's the house I grew up in. 5 rooms, 1 bath without a sink. There was a time, of course, my brothers were a little bit older, so eventually they went off to serve, and I had my own room. But, of course, no one really had your own personal or private space. I used to say that my personal space was the size of a sketchbook, because when I started to draw, everything else sort of melted away. I went to the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, Philadelphia Museum College of Art. I started in 1957, and at that point, as Loretta talked about, I had studied commercial art in high school, where we learned to render and develop a craftsmanship. But it was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that I experienced painting in a way, and at that time, abstract expressionism was the theme. Now, before I entered the Philadelphia Museum College of Art, I had never been into a museum or gallery in my life. But first, the gallery visit was in 1957. In 1963, I bought my first piece of art. I can't tell you how much at home I was inside of a museum. These were the paintings that I did during my stay in the Philadelphia Museum College of Art. But what I want you to think about is when you look at these paintings and see that it's the same hand. It's the same hand, it's the same sense of color, the same sense of balance. You can see it there. This is an early poster that I did for the Boston Jazz Festival. I had left school and was working for first a greeting card company and then an illustration design house, but I wasn't satisfied or fulfilled with some of the projects, so I worked very hard to do a lot of work that was for the community or for the city of Boston. This is later. This is a little later, but yeah, it's still the same in the 60s or 70s. But again, look at the color sense and the hand. This was for an insurance company. It's kind of interesting the way they were doing this. But anyway, I had illustrated my first book, The Adventures of Spider, and I was really, truly interested in children's literature, but it was very difficult to make a living. So I did other things. I did advertising. I did promotional work. I also did a lot of work in textbooks. As a matter of fact, my first full-color book, Toni and you guys would know, that didn't come until 1984. I had been illustrating books for, 20 years until I did my first full-color book. This was earlier work in the 60s, but it was textbook. And this was for a series I did called This Is Music. They were watercolor or Luma dyes on paper. I also started doing a lot of, again, connecting with the love of music. I did album covers, and this is for Mahler's. A whole series. I did 2, I think I have them here, on Mahler. I'm not sure where it came from, this love of classical music. It probably was the exposure to all kinds of music when I was growing up. but I was also looking for projects that spoke to not only my love of music, but my love of nature. So I did these 2 album covers for RCA, for Mahler. I think that in many ways, too, as a kid growing up, and limited in terms of exposure to certain areas, I think when I became an adult, I became hungry to explore as much as possible. And I used the gift that I have of actually being able to visualize things as a bridge to not only giving me an opportunity to express the love of painting, but also to provide for my family, but to introduce myself to different worlds. And you'll see that coming up. These were a series of, now up until that time, most of the work that I was doing was usually, it was folk tales, but there were folk tales from around the world, Mexico, India, and there were a lot of African folk tales, but I didn't actually get an opportunity to do contemporary African American subject matter. It just wasn't around at that time. Now, I started working for clients, this was for Seagram's, where the focus was, and there was a kind of blossoming and a really need to understand African American contribution, African American history and culture. So I did a series of paintings, and you'll see here, for Seagram's calendar. And there was, before I started this series here, they were doing portraits of famous African American folk, and they sort of ran out of ideas, and they came to me, and we did a number of things. We did 3 calendars. One was African Americans and or people of color in the Revolutionary War. There's York, Lewis and Clark. I mean, what was happening at this time was that I was beginning to delve and unpeel my own history. And again, Seagram's allowed me to do that. So doing that was Pap Stapleton and the Exodusters, which is, by the way, is a story I want to do. It's the story of people of color going west and crossing the Mississippi. And I mean, to me, it's such a romantic and heroic adventure. It didn't work out so well, but we do know of there are towns, Nicodemus, that still exist, of African American towns and that had their own sense of governance and schools and whatnot. But I was Pap Stapleton, of course, the West. As a kid growing up, we went to cowboy movies every Saturday, double features. Boy, we would keep that excitement going by coming back to our block and figuring out how we could keep that energy going. And we would adorn ourselves of whatever we could find and buy at the Five and Dime, and we became cowboys. And we also, not cowboys, but also explorers. I was Daniel Boone. I had a coonskin cap with a tail in the back. I was Roy Rogers. I was Gene Autry. It wasn't until I was an adult that I found out that 1 out of every 3 cowboys was a person of color, either black or Mexican. The Great Migration, and it moved on. These are some of the images I did that based around jazz. Roy Eldridge, Jelly Roll Morton. And it was in the 70s where, and you will see the stylistic, there's going to be a change. What's the 70s? This is Song of the Trees by Mildred Taylor. I think that was probably one of the first books, I think J.D., where it dealt with African-American life through a different lens. We weren't talking about hundreds of years ago, but recent history and or living history. And then it was a turn in the work. I didn't use as reference photographs of musicians or of cowboys and whatnot. This was much closer to me in many ways, so that I started working with models. And the models most often were not, if not family, they were friends of the family. And you can see reaching for, now what I'm reaching for is to personalize these individuals. I wanted you to, in a sense, believe you know them. And in a way, I was celebrating this sort of diversity in terms of us folks as African Americans. This is Dry Longso, Virginia Hamilton. It's a powerful story. Dry Longso is a mythical character, and it's a dowsing rod. When you were kids, did you ever try to search for water with a dowsing rod? No? Has anybody tried as a kid? Well, yeah, as a kid, sure. And but this is this. So there's always this kind of connection. Anyway, Dry Longso, Virginia Hamilton. That's my granddaughter, and it's this really mythical story about. It takes place in Texas. There's a drought, and we see this dust storm on the horizon. And in front of that storm is Dry Longso. And Dry Longso, with the help of a dowsing rod, finds water. Of course, they're able to grow crops. And one morning, of course, the family gets up, and Dry Longso has disappeared. And the sense is that Dry Longso now moves on, whether he takes another form, but to help someone else. Dry Longso by Virginia Hamilton. God Bless the Child. The lyrics of Billie Holiday and Arthur Kershaw Jr. I was asked to illustrate the lyrics, and I was trying to figure out a way to approach it. And at first I thought about when Billie Holiday was very popular, and so I thought about during the Great Depression, during that 1930s and 1940s, 45. But what I didn't mention was full knowledge of certainly my parents and their grandparents migrating from the South, but they did not talk about the South. You couldn't get anything out of them, almost as if their lives began when they crossed the Mason-Dixie line. And so I thought about the Great Depression, and I kind of related that with my parents and their parents. And so if you look closely at the lyrics to God Bless the Child, they're sparse. They don't talk about a time or a place. So I thought this was perfect. I would tell what I believe to be my parents' story through the lyrics of God Bless the Child. I also made the connection that I always felt when I heard, because I grew up on Billie Holiday and that song, God Bless the Child, that it was always my mother talking to me. It was always my mother talking to me. One of the things I asked of people when they look at my pictures is look behind the main action. What I'm involved with is really visual storytelling. There is usually a text, or in this case, a lyrics. But the stories the intent is to tell a bigger picture. I started interviewing people who had sharecropped, who had migrated, and discovered, first of all, that I knew very little bit about that time. And there were a lot of things that happened out of these conversations that sort of stimulated the images that you find here. One of the things is, of course, we know about sharecropping. We know about it in terms of hard work. But I have someone who I love dearly, who's really an old friend of mine now, who's worked for us when there are yard work and things like that. And his name is Willie, and Willie sharecropped. And so I said, let's sit down. I want to talk about that. And the things I asked was things like, did you play? What was your relationship with family? What was interesting is that when I talked about that, asked that very stupid question, did you play? What did you do? his face would light up, and he would talk about that Saturday when they would all get in a truck or a wagon, they would go to town. He also talked about what it was like to work alongside your parents and your grandparents. That, in a way, he turned what I had thought to be this really challenging and difficult time into something else. These pictures speak to that. There's a young lady whose obviously his back is hurting. But if you go across the screen, there's a young boy trying to catch a butterfly. Of course, the migration itself, when individuals and families would pack up whatever they thought was important to them to move north. Keep in mind the center image of the young boy with the red flyer wagon. Hold on to that? Okay. So they're packing up, they're going by car. Gloria and I were doing a book tour in the South, North Carolina, and I kept seeing abandoned buildings. It just it threw me. It's kind of an eerie thing to think about. Now we were in another place where we find abandoned homes. But at that time, it was really unusual for me coming from the north, and so I asked the driver to stop and to take a picture of this house. And I was fascinated with the chair. And the chair seemed to have so many stories. I mean, what happened? Was that a dining room chair? Did they have a dining room? Did they quilt? So I held onto this picture, filed it away, and then when I got the opportunity to do God Bless the Child, I pulled it out and I was using it, and not necessarily for reference, but in sense for inspiration, you know. And there's a sketch for the final painting. Yeah. Now look through the gate. What do you find? The wagon. That precious wagon, there wasn't enough room to take it with them. I don't know about, but the cars were a big thing when I was growing up. It showed how well you were doing. And they finally find their way north to Yonkers or Detroit or to Chicago, and the importance of meeting relatives who have been there and established. The story does not reflect really Billie Holiday. It's inspired by the song and the lyrics. This is the only time where we really speak about music, but we're speaking about my family, because when we would get together when I was young, it was always built around food. Tell me about time, Loretta. A little bit. Okay, we'll move through. The Tales of Uncle Remus. You see a work in progress, a colored sketch. I did 4 volumes with Julius Lester. The 4th volume, the title is The Last Tales of Uncle Remus. The Last Tales. And I'm going to go through there very fast. These, and by the way, these folk tales, I do a lot of fiction, but the staging, the setting is always authentic to the time period and the place, a sense of place for sure. John Henry, the power of this book on me, and I think it certainly reflects in terms of the illustrations. When you pick up this book, you'll notice that there is always, in most cases, there is John Henry, but there's usually he's always cropped in some way. And the idea was that John Henry was too big to hold the book. There he is. And Julius Lester, we've done some great things. And here, John Henry hammers so fast and so hard that he actually creates a rainbow. There we see him leave the tunnel. And let's move through here. Black Cowboy, Wild Horses. Hey, Julius Lester and I got a chance to play cowboys. This time I was a person of color. True story of a black cowboy who had a very unique way of herding mustangs on the plains of Texas. He went out alone on his horse Warrior. He would lose his human scent. He was a great tracker. And when he found a herd, he would follow them and get closer and closer. So at some point, when the herd would get used to him being there, around, he would join the herd and become and ride with them on his horse. And at some point, this is invented, of course, but the strategy he used was not. Here you see a rattler strikes, a young foal goes down, and our cowboy would use that, some sort of experience or situation where the herd would be disoriented or distracted, and then he would challenge the stallion. He was expert at that, and of course he would win and force the stallion away from the herd, and then become the leader of the herd and take the herd back to the corral. Here you see reverence to not only our black cowboy, but of a cowboys from Mexico, Mexican cowboys. And we'll move quite quickly through these. This is an important also book, Hans Christian Andersen, A Little Match Girl. The setting and the stagings of these classic stories were usually, I love the 1920s and 1930s. It's a powerful story. Gloria and I decided, Gloria loved this story, I did too, but we kind of sort of in some way paralleled that to sometimes the misuse of children. Noah's Ark. And what you see happening here is when you see me tackle these projects like this, you'll find that they usually parallel a kind of a growth spurt or an interest, and in this case, a renewed interest in the church and history, in Bible stories. Journeys with Elijah. These are Jewish folk tales. Elijah in 6 time periods and I think 7 different countries. Elijah in North Africa. This is from David's songs. King David. David as an old man, he talked about himself as like an owl in the ruins. I love the understanding of the cultures. This is from The Wild Children. Takes place in Russia during the Russian Revolution. Powerful story about young people who would form bands or gangs in order to protect one another. The Wild Children. Gloria Jean, my wife, we did about 4 projects. This is a project Back Home, Sunday Outing, all stories about that really was inspired by not memoirs, but things that happened to her when she was growing up as a young 8-year-old. I work for a lot of different clients. They all feed into the work that I do for children's literature. This was done for the National Park Service, Booker T. Washington National Monument. Again with Julius Lester, the old African. The story of Ebo Landing. How does Jerry Pinkney in his studio in Croton-on-the-Hudson deal with plantation life? It's through the research that I do. There's a powerful scene where it opens with a young boy being beaten, and the slaves surrounded this incident. And how do I get there? Well, I get there, I remember the ring shout. I've seen images and moving pictures of the ring shout, and the old African, who's the main character, has these magical powers that can strip the pain from everyone. And I thought he would mesmerize. And I thought, so I found this picture of the ring shout. So I start there. And it's redrawing and inhabiting all these different characters until I get it right. It's a powerful, powerful story about Ebo Landing. The story is, of course, that there is a group of enslaved Ebo, who decide to go back to Nigeria by way of walking on the ocean floor. That's the hull of the ship. There you see them at the time when the old African guides them through into the water. Under the water, they find out they can breathe. There are many, many versions of the story of Ebo landing, and most oftentimes the story ends here at this point with Julius and I. The story ends with their return to Nigeria and the celebration. Lights, please. I think we may have just a little space for questions and answers. I know it's running late, and but there was a lot. Well, I had 50 years to share with you guys. That's a long time. I did pretty good, right?
It's just a quick question about, will you remind me the name of the young man with the divining rod again?
Dry Long So.
I haven't heard that in so long. Thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, thank you.
I haven't heard that story since I was a little kid.
Oh,
Thank you.
Dry Long So, dry.
Anyone else?
Yes. The Igbo was from Nigeria, and they were enslaved by other African tribes and brought to America. And they were this particular story or this myth comes out of Georgia. I'm sorry, South Carolina, the shores of South Carolina. By the way, I worked on that particular project. The Igbo were not documented, and so it was very hard to find research reference on them. And I worked with an Igbo, a historian, who was also an Igbo out of California Tech, and it was an amazing experience that I'll never forget. Just his experience. Yes. Ah.
Yeah.
Oh.
There are a lot of Igbos here in San Francisco as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What I'm sorry, but to digress, but just something on that parallel. What was interesting for me was I was really very nervous about. Okay. For an African American to tackle the life of Africans and their experience was really kind of challenging. I knew I wanted to do it right. And so I contacted the Schonberg, and also they introduced me to Dr. Uri. And he and I had a lot of conversations, and this is what I told him. I don't want to know what I'm doing right. I want to know what I'm doing wrong. It was a really powerful exchange.
Jerry, can I speak for all the illustrators in the room and
Yes.
just ask you what kind of paper you use and what kind of watercolors and just a little bit about your process?
The paper that you see of the latest work is Arch's hot press, and the reason for that is that a line plays a very active role in the work, so so it's the hot press. But earlier on, those very early images, they were always on Arch's cold press. The watercolors are usually just a straight Winsor Newton. They seem to reproduce well. And so it's pencil and watercolor on paper.
So do you start with a pencil line and then do many layers of watercolor?
Yeah, I start with a pencil line, and then I actually stretch the paper, which you guys, it's a matter of putting the paper in and drawing in a tub of water, and then it's placed on a plywood and you tack it down. So when it dries, it sort of stretches and it gets as tight as a drum, which allows me to work very freely with very loose washes, and the paper always returns flat again. So it's a great surface. It's wet on dry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
Appreciate the beautiful slideshow.
My
Thank you.
question is technical also, since I'm an illustrator as well. I see that you're doing it all watercolor, and my experience it was that they preferred at one point for me to go straight to computer. And my question is, how do you feel about that?
Well, I guess one thing is, if I describe my working space, there's no computer, no telephone, and no television. And I talked about tools and the importance of tools. I mean, you're younger, and I think that is going to be the temptation of art directors and especially art director and production people to push in that way. It's easier for them. But you have to stick to your guns. I mean, you have to. I mean, illustration is hard enough. So you got to find a thing that you believe in, and you just stick to it. Now, I say that, and understand that I've been doing this for a long time, so it's a lot easier for me to make those decisions than you. But you fight it, or you learn to use it as a tool for yourself. Yes.
Where are you from? Genealogy. So I was just wondering if you have gone back further, or
No, my wife can go back to Africa, but I can't. I can go back maybe 3 generations. I know Skip Gates, and my wife keeps telling you got to call him and tell him you got to do. But there's a lot of websites that I should be beginning to look, And I just started interviewing my aunt, who just turned 90 and has amazing memory, and she's more open to talk about it, and that's certainly on my agenda. And it needs to be done. It really needs to be done.
One more.
Hello.
Hi.
I know you work with Virginia Hamilton, and I was just wondering, when you collaborated with her, did you share ideas about folk tales? Because I know she's heavily into it.
It's very interesting. No, I worked with Virginia first one, Jadot, and I hadn't met her. And usually the way things work is the author and illustrator are separated. When I did get a chance to really know her, we talked about, certainly it was obvious her interest and in African American literature and the flavor of storytelling. Yeah, I guess the answer is yes, but on the different projects we worked on, we never discussed that particular project. But we certainly discussed literature. And what I remember about Virginia was so powerful was when we did Sam and the Tigers, the adapting of Little Black Sambo. There was a lot of controversy built around it, but I remember Virginia saying, yay. Yeah. Okay.
We want to thank the WNBA for their continued support for the lecture series. They have been true collaborators, and it's always a pleasure to work with them.